I'm Laura Welch. Welcome to ABC Book Introductions. Let's get started. A. Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, published 1920. By the time Edith Wharton won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, she was already a well-received published author. This story takes place in New York City. A gregarious woman has returned home to New York after leaving her husband, a Polish duke. The Duchess meets her sweet cousin's boyfriend and can't help but play with his heart. Her cousin marries him. She does not know of his side flirtation, and of course he is conflicted and wishes for a way out to leave his new wife for the Duchess. In the meantime, the Duchess's New York family makes it quite clear that a divorce is not as acceptable as separation. Just as he is about to break up with his young wife, she tells him she's pregnant. He stays for the family. The Duchess moves to Paris. In the end, the husband, now a comfortable father, and son are in Paris with plans to see the child's aunt, the Duchess. The gentleman stays downstairs, preferring his memories. B. Bleak House by Charles Dickens, published 1853. Charles Dickens wrote about wealth and poverty in England's late 1800s. His writing is thick, but he offers both rich characterizations and engaging dramatic twists. It is a great soap opera. Bleak House was initially published in 12 different episodes in 1853. There are illegitimate children, there is murder, smallpox, retribution, and finally, love. The whole farce is a satire that pokes at the healthy and how laws string along the rich and poor alike. This is a dense drama featuring a very long, drawn-out court case that slowly squeezes money out of the inheritance between three cousins, and two of them are married. They are encouraged to live at the sad-looking estate of the lawyer called Bleak House. Finally, after many years of litigation, the case settles. The couple are relieved to hear that they won. Unfortunately, most of the money is gone, used up by lawyers' costs. C. Captains Courageous by Rudyard Kipling, published 1896. The story was originally printed in a serial for over a year. The author, Rudyard Kipling, known for The Jungle Book, normally placed his stories in India, but this took place in North America while the author lived in Vermont. The many adventures had by the protagonist are considered some of the best in young adult, adventure, and even nautical literature. A teenaged boy, the spoiled son of a railroad tycoon, falls off of a steamship and into the ocean. He's pulled out and saved by the captain of a Portuguese fishing boat. They wouldn't return him to shore, and they didn't believe he had a lot of money. His only choice was to stay on the ship and work for his stay. His life made him mature quickly, so when he returned home, his parents were impressed. They send the boy to business school and reward the ship's captain who'd saved him. D. Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol, published 1842. Gogol examines the desperation of Russian people as they try to adapt and survive a growing industrial revolution. The main character is an average man, named Chichikov, who arrives into town and starts telling landowners he'd like to buy the tax papers of their dead serfs, unaccounted for until the next census, telling them he's helping them by relieving the tax debt. It isn't always easy. The landowners are greedy too. Once he gained the ownership of about 400 souls, we find out the plan, or shall we say scam, to make out a loan against the papers and make a big profit off of the ownership of deceased serfs or indentured servants. His plot is upset, and he gets ostracized and has to flee. Chichikov moves elsewhere in Russia, near a general who has a beautiful daughter. There are lots of odd and interesting characters. He tries to pull another scam by forging a will. It ends leaving the reader to wonder about other confidence scams Chichikov could get into. Gogol planned for this to be the first of a 3-part series. Gogol burned the entirety of the second of the series, and the third was never written. E. Emma, written by Jane Austen, published 1816. Life in a small town in England. Emma is left alone with her widowed father, but she is restless and likes to get involved in her friends' affairs. Emma focuses on a local girl, Harriet Smith, and tries to involve herself in Harriet's future. Emma meddles with Harriet's marriage likelihood and fails. Emma inappropriately intercedes on several other friends' behalf, but causes the worst harm to Harriet. Harriet feels she's grown up, however, and is quite full of herself. Harriet thinks that Emma's old sweetheart desires to marry her, but that is not true, and she feels defeated and humbled when she was no better off than before. Ultimately, Emma marries her old sweetheart, and Harriet marries the man she was sweet on before Emma got her hands on her. This is the classic tale of the unnecessary makeover. Jane Austen is also famous for her novel Pride and Prejudice. F. Frankenstein by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, published 1816. Written in a contest while on vacation in the Swiss Alps. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley was the only one who completed a story for the ghost story competition. We meet a nobleman named Frankenstein who is obsessed with mysticism and the goal to discover the elixir of life. By collecting his skills and knowledge, he created life out of a dead man. Unfortunately, the man is monstrous, huge, and revolting in appearance. The monster flees and hides himself in the community where he accidentally damages and even kills the living around him. Frankenstein finds the monster, but does not kill him, for pity. The monster only wanted company and asked for a wife. Frankenstein nearly completes the job of bringing life to a woman, but he gets freaked out about starting the possibility of a lineage of monsters and doesn't finish. The monster finds revenge by finding and killing Frankenstein's bride-to-be and his best friend. The monster flees to the Arctic. Frankenstein goes north, too, to find him. At the end, the monster is found standing over Frankenstein, lying dead on the ice after the monster murdered him. G. Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, published 1939. This story reflects America's Great Depression and the great migration of people who moved out of Oklahoma to find work in the fields and farms of California. The Joad family must leave their home, desperately hoping to find work in California. There are many in this vehicle, but the story generally centers on Tom, the oldest adult brother. The road trip brings many tales of struggle, including Tom's involvement in the workers' movement, a murder, his sister's baby's birth, and the death of his grandparents. The family is in complete desperation, but Ma, Tom's mother, is the rock of the family. Her faithfulness encourages the family to keep their chin up and have hope. John Steinbeck wrote many famous novels that focused on Northern California. Other famous books written by Steinbeck are Tortilla Flat, Of Mice and Men, and The Pearl. H. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, published 1902. Author Joseph Conrad was a Polish English novelist whose first language was Polish, but wrote his novels in beautiful untranslated English. This novella, or short novel, takes place on a river steamer in Africa, somewhere likely on the Congo. The protagonist is the captain, and he tells the story of an English ivory trader named Kurtz while doing business transporting goods. There is a comparison made between the dark, unseen crime in the wild terrain of the Congo and London, a great city. Equally, we see light and dark literally and figuratively in this novel. Kurtz is well known for his financial successes. He is loved and appreciated by the natives. Unfortunately, Kurtz begins a protracted illness. The protagonist believes the competing companies are trying to kill him. Ultimately, Kurtz succumbs to his disease. His last words are, "The horror, the horror." Here we wonder if this lifestyle of swashbuckling was worth it. Our protagonist brings the deceased Kurtz items to Kurtz's fiancée, still mourning, even though Kurtz had died a year earlier. Our protagonist sympathized with her loss and told her that Kurtz's last words were her name. I, the Idiot, by Fyodor Dostoevsky, published 1868. A young man of the upper but not the richest ranks of early St. Petersburg is our protagonist, a gentle soul with no notable negative qualities. Sometimes this trait brought others to think he was simple-minded. Actually, he was epileptic, and each recovery after each seizure was hard. He is seen as a Jesus figure, as he is purposeful, chaste, and charitable. He meets a dynamic man who would be our protagonist's best friend-dummy. In this story, the threat is right where one wants to place their trust, in their best friend. Our protagonist loves but denies a lovely, nice girl because he feels like she deserves more than a weak asthmatic person. He instead falls in love through charitable pity with an older, experienced body woman. She knows she's no good compared to his sense of virtue and declines his advances. The terrible turn happens when the beautiful but bawdy woman starts seeing and then ultimately marries the aforementioned friend enemy. The sweet girlfriend marries someone else. The new wife of the friend enemy is murdered by the enemy because he was impassioned. The idiot is so named to suggest that by trying not to be an idiot, ultimately, he was. K. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson, published 1886. This serial follows a fictionalized young man whose uncle has him kidnapped so as to obscure the rightful ownership of the family property. The property belongs to the young man, but the uncle figures his nephew won't fight for what is his if he never knows it is his. Our protagonist carries on with many great adventures with and without a good friend who is in many of the stories. There are exciting experiences, murder, unhappiness, and perilous moments. It sold a lot of paper. Ultimately, the story brings the protagonist back home where, rather abruptly, the inheritance is figured out in his favor. Apparently, Robert Louis Stevenson had wrapped it up because he fell ill. Several years after the book version of Kidnapped was released, however, the author had published a sequel for those who wanted more. L. Light in August, written by William Faulkner, published 1932. William Faulkner was famous as an official representative of a style of literature that became known as Southern Gothic literature. More literally, we may see this as literature that exposes the rough, grotesque elements of the American South during the Jim Crow era. It is an allegory of America's conflict between growing sinful modernism and the prejudiced puritanical rural South. The story takes place in the early 1930s in Alabama. Prohibition has started. The story starts by finding a young pregnant woman who has been trying to find her boyfriend who came out to work. She finally finds him working with two other men. One of the men is very moral and kind, but the other is cruel, hot-tempered, and violent. The cruel man was running an illegal alcohol operation and using the sawmill as a cover. He was also having a secretive affair with a prominent woman. The prominent woman, however, became particularly religious and annoying, and somehow she was found dead. The moral man is briefly suspected, and it terrifies him. So he deflects blame off of himself and onto the larger, violent man, being sure to out his coworker by telling the police that though this coworker was pale, he was part black too. Righteous. The cruel man was guilty as charged and put to death for murder. The pregnant girl is abandoned by the boyfriend once she gives birth, and she ends up with the good and moral man after all. The final scene watches the three of them get on a train together to start fresh. M. Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, published 1886. Rural England. A drunk husband rudely and carelessly auctions his wife and daughter off to a sailor. The wife threatened her husband that she wouldn't fight it if he didn't take the thing seriously. He didn't. And when he came to, his wife and daughter are indeed gone to some unknown place, worse, because he couldn't remember the sailor's name. 17 years later, they came back into town looking for the father who had auctioned them off. They had been incorrectly informed of the sailor's death. They found he had risen to the rank of mayor, running a shipping company. He welcomed them and even remarried his wife. They were happy until the wife died a year later. After his wife had died, the man realized this was not his biological daughter, but the daughter of the sailor. His only child had died as an infant. The daughter is dismayed at the change that came over him. He was cold to her now. The daughter finds her sailor father alive. She marries the manager of the company, but stays mad at her mother's first husband. She decides to forgive him ultimately and goes to him when she hears he was ill, but he died 15 minutes before she arrived. Anne, Notre Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo, published 1831. Set in medieval Paris, 1482. The author describes with detail the buildings, sculptures, thieves' dens, and witch trials. We find our hero is a man named Quasimodo, who is a deaf and considered grotesque, deformed man with a spinal hunch. He is the bell ringer for the cathedral. Quasimodo is hopelessly in love with Esmeralda, a singer and dancer. She is also desired by an archdeacon of the cathedral, but she does not return his passion. In retaliation, the archdeacon turns her over to the authorities for the murder he'd committed himself, the murder of the man Esmeralda wanted. She is punished for the murder of her lover that she did not commit. She was punished by being hanged, but was saved by Quasimodo and preserved in the safety of the church. She is recaptured, and this time Esmeralda dies. Quasimodo is so upset that he pushes the deacon off the church tower. He then goes down to where Esmeralda's body is. Many years later, they find his deformed skeleton holding her body. As they try to pull the skeletons apart, Quasimodo's skeleton falls to dust. O Pioneers by Willa Cather, published 1913. This story tells of life in Nebraska in the late 1880s. The father of the family grows weak and dies, feeling like he had failed the farm. After he died, his oldest daughter took the lead to keep the family and farm together. Ultimately, her freshness got her siblings and mother through their dark and depressed time. The fate of the farm changed, and the farm profited well. When the oldest daughter falls in love with a man of relative poverty, a man she had known since childhood, the family pressures her to think of him as below them. He leaves town to try to make money in the Klondike. When her brother is killed by a jealous husband and the other brother is jailed, she is glad to know her favorite love decided against going to the Klondike and decided to stay and marry his girl and help carry the legacy of the farm. They decide to marry freely. The title, O Pioneers, is an allusion to Walt Whitman's poem, O Pioneers, O Pioneers, from his book of poetry, Leaves of Grass. P. Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw, published 1912. An eccentric professor who specialized in pronunciation and language overheard an English Cockney woman and found her accent to be hideous enough to make comment on to his companion. His eccentric ways drew attention to them as well, so when the woman overheard a veiled bet that he could pass her off as a duchess, she showed up on her own to take voice lessons. She is a tough student, very challenging, as it takes a long time to get her to really try. Soon it will be time to show the new student. He brings the young woman to meet his mother and siblings. The young woman is dressed as a fine lady. She only speaks of the weather and general health. Everyone thinks she's charming, and it seems the training was successful and the bet was won. The young woman feels used and abused and angrily chastises the professor and stomps out. Although it is made clear that they will never marry, he reaches out to her and takes her home with him, where it is implied that they will live happily ever after. R. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, published 1938. Rebecca is a shy person, newly married. Rebecca realizes that her husband's first wife was not dead, but still living. Unfortunately, we learn that the new husband murders his wife, but there was a reason for it. The first wife was riddled with cancer and had driven him to madness to get him to murder her, rather than have to live with the pain of the cancer. When Rebecca's body is given to the town's doctor, the cause of death was suicide because of cancer and not murder. As the pair return home, they find that their house is in flames. Everything is lost. And with the loss of the home and items, all memories of the estate would soon be gone too. Rebecca reminds me of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte from 1847. Jane Eyre alternately has a relatively shy young woman who falls in love with her employer and finds out that he is already married and his wife is insane and confined in the house. Jane is sad and leaves. Years later, she returns to find her love, to find his house burned down, and now he is blind. The crazy wife had burnt the house down and had died. Jane and her guy live happily ever after. Jane Eyre was written in 1847, and Rebecca was written in 1938. Interesting. S. 7 Pillars of Wisdom by Thomas Edward Lawrence, published 1935. This is a monumental memoir of a British colonel in Egypt during World War I. This memoir, or an autobiography of a particular time, was very famous and was later reproduced into a smaller, more condensed book called Revolt in the Desert. It was also made into an epic movie called Lawrence of Arabia. Our author, Thomas Lawrence, spent many years in Saudi Arabia and was quite familiar with the terrain of the formidable desert. His experience with the English, Egyptian, and Turkish military prompted him to encourage the Saudi Arabians to ally with Great Britain, while Turkey was siding with Germany. Germany had been manhandling Turkey, so they thought it was a good idea to ally with England and antagonize the nation which claimed to master them at the same time. Long and beautiful war stories identified not only significant military expertise, but also exhibited the people and customs of the regions of the conflict. Lawrence also worked as an advisor to the Arabians, and they successfully resisted the Ottoman Empire from 1916 to 1918. After his British service, Lawrence quietly changed his name and worked as an airplane mechanic until he died in a motorcycle accident in 1935. T. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, published 1844. A young Frenchman seeks his fortune in the world. His father, somewhat ridiculously, sends his son on an old horse to the king's castle to represent himself to serve in the musketeers. His father also sends him off with a letter in support of the boy's good name. All of this is useless because the son is also wildly ignorant of how the musketeers work or any other rudimentary element of fighting. He is very good at boasting and bragging, however, making his arrogance and youthful enthusiasm somewhat funny. On his trip, he loses his horse, his sword, and his letter of introduction. He is constantly wishing to fight. He meets 3 different musketeers and feels disrespected by each of them. Although he fights all 3, he wins none of them and still becomes close friends with all 3. In wild events, they all become a batch of buddies who support the kid's effort to become a musketeer too. The king is not amused. There is a woman involved. There are masterful archetypical characters here. There's the sage, the vain, the hero, the innocent, the vixen, and of course the villain. The Three Musketeers is just one of 4 in a series of books Dumas wrote about the musketeers, including Man in the Iron Mask. Ulysses by James Joyce, published 1922. Considered a great work in the stream of consciousness literature movement, it is also infamous. First, it is a taxing read. It intentionally leads the reader with a pretty flat narrative arc. It is an intentional comparison to Homer's Odyssey and considered a modern allegory. In a most arduous and convoluted tale, we loosely follow 2 men who intersect without knowing twice before meeting at the end of the evening at a brothel. Everyone is a mess, and the wife of one of the fellows at the brothel muses philosophically alone at the end. The story is readable for many in short doses. Literary techniques used make this fun to read for those enjoying the art of James Joyce. There are different styles for the different characters: internal dialogue, free association, question and answer sections, and stage directions that the reader enjoys. The other infamous element of this book is the very public court case where it was accused of obscenity. A United States District Court judge judged in favor of the book's publication. He'd read the book and text in question and decided that though it was boring, it was not too suggestive. V. Vanity Fair by William Thackeray, published between 1847 and 1848. This book ran initially as a serial that ran for 19 monthly episodes. It was a satire that played on the quirks and qualities of the British culture of the time. The story follows two young women. One is poor and headstrong. The other is wealthy and timid. They are friends. Becky, the gutsier one, rose in social status, while her friend, the timid one, loses social traction. As in all English dramas of this time, immorality was punished. All bad people go down. The story is an excellent serial, so the modern adaptations have been a lot like soap operas. Interestingly, the story is notable for what it does not have: a hero or a heroine. Both young women have interesting lives and issues, but there's no single protagonist. W. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, published 1847. A wealthy family takes in a young boy named Heathcliff, who grows up with young Catherine. They fell in love, but when they were marriageable, she mindlessly told her friends that marrying him would be to marry someone below her. He overhears this and leaves for years. On his return, he finds Catherine married and pregnant. Heathcliff seeks revenge by overwhelming Catherine's husband in a gamble where Heathcliff won the property to Catherine and his childhood home, Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff further injures Catherine by marrying Catherine's sister-in-law. Catherine is exhausted and broken by Heathcliff's behaviors. She gives birth to her baby girl and dies. Heathcliff's wife, secretly pregnant, is disturbed and terrified of her husband and leaves. She raises the boy, so he does not know his father. When Heathcliff's wife died, he finally did collect the child, who turned out to be regularly very ill. Now, Catherine's daughter and Heathcliff's son are coerced into marrying. But within days, the sickly new married man dies. Everyone is miserable. Heathcliff dies as painful and lonely as when he came to the family. The gates of the estate are closed to forget all of the tragedies. Why? The Yearling by Marjorie Keenan Rawlings, published 1938. Written in swampy North Florida, this story follows a boy who, with his mother and father, lives in a terrain that is difficult to raise crops on because of the animals, the predators, and the storms. Young Jody is about 12 when he befriends and raises a fawn. The reader watches Jody and the deer grow up together for about a year. There's a hurricane, the death of the only boy and friend that lives in the region, and a terrible disagreement between Jody and his father. The nice thing is that there is never any stress too difficult for the loving relationships of his parents and their son. The problem, however, begins to become clear when the deer has gotten so big during a time of starvation that it started eating their corn in the field. That corn was the last of their seeds, too. Disastrous. To protect the crops, the young deer must be killed. It is devastating, but the point of life in a wild homestead is to survive. The event changes Jody from a child to a young man.